This is me testing the mic. Hopefully it sounds okay. I don't know if it does, but I guess we'll find out. Hi, I'm your local insane internet person, and today I'm going to be talking about whether you should invest in gacha games. Not just monetarily, even if it's not really investing, it's more like NFTs in the sense that it's just gambling but with colorful pictures, but also with your time, effort, and maybe even love. So real quick, for the three of you watching this who don't know what gacha games are, it doesn't have an actual concrete definition, but here's one that I wrote. To me, it is any game that requires engaging with an aspect of gambling, whether with in-game or real-life currencies, in order to experience the game in its entirety. And that definition might seem very vague, but I'll hopefully get more into that later. So, gacha as a video game genre had been pretty niche for the longest time, and yes, there are titles that the large majority of people who play mobile games are aware of. These titles would be considered real video games for a very long time, and now it would be impossible and wrong to attribute the success of an entire genre of video games to just one game. But there's one title that kind of became the face of the entire genre, and that very title came with the release of Genshin Impact in late 2020 by mAIBeenot, also now known as Hoyoverse, which I'll be using to refer to them for the rest of this presentation. So, why did Genshin succeed? Genshin isn't exactly a pioneer in the world of video games by any means, so why did it blow up so much? Well, the initial first impression most people will have of this game will likely be the graphics. It's warm, it's vibrant, it's welcoming, the characters are all appealing, and the world is vast and full of wonder. It's just so pleasant and warm. The game itself is in a somewhat untapped market as well. It is an open-world action RPG. It's a game with visuals of this quality and this big of a scale, and it's free to play? That sounds almost too good to be true. And lastly, like the key to any good business venture, it just happened to come out at the right place and the right time. The right place being basically every platform ever, and it runs surprisingly well on a lot of devices. Like, you don't need a big boy gaming PC to play this game. And if you were lucky, it runs on your phone. And the right time being when we were all caged in our homes in the year that was 2020. That said, was Genshin's success earned? Genshin certainly wasn't Hoyoverse's first foray into the world of anime-style gacha games. In fact, these types of things have been their bread and butter for basically as long as they've been a company. So then, was Genshin actually any good, or was it just really lucky? I raise you 2 points. I do think it is higher quality than the other existing Hoyoverse games. Well, I say that. Genshin wasn't the first Hoyoverse game I played. That honor would go to Honkai Impact III, and I do think that Genshin is better solely because it just feels better to play. It's much smoother and the controls just feel so much more intuitive and responsive. And it's generally just a more refreshing take on gacha games, as it is one of the few, or at least it is the pioneer of gacha games where you don't have to spend a limited amount of energy that recharges over time in order to do main story quests. Ever since Genshin's massive success and popularity that soon turned into infamy, there's been a lot of stigma around gacha games, so I just want to make clear what my stances are. 1. Not all gacha games are doomed to be bad. Gacha games are still real games, whatever that means, and the mechanics within these types of games can and do exist outside of their gacha aspect. However, gacha is only a monetization method and does not affect the gameplay is also wrong. A game being a gacha game can and does directly affect its gameplay and therefore its enjoyability. Regardless of the fact that gacha is a monetization method, an extremely predatory one at that, gacha games are still effectively a genre because that gacha aspect has to be ingrained so deeply into the gameplay itself in order to be profitable at all, especially if your game is free to play. Now, some gacha games may be exempt from this statement. Like I said in my definition before, there are some gacha games where you really don't need to gamble in order to actually enjoy the game long term. The gambling is just another aspect on top of it. Is it bad still? Yes, but not as bad, in my opinion at least. Now, many people like to say that Genshin has gotten worse, or maybe Genshin was never good in the first place. Both of these arguments, while valid in some aspects, don't fully encompass the things that I personally feel. Like I said before, Genshin was not the first Hoyoverse game I played. That honor would go to Honkai Impact III. but Genshin just kind of sucked me in way more in a way that Honkai Impact simply couldn't. The thing that drew me in initially were the graphics, like it did for many others. However, the thing that kept me going for that initial high, it wasn't the characters, it wasn't the gacha. I didn't even understand what the gacha was or what it did at the time. What really kept me going pretty strongly and consistently was the gameplay. While the combat itself only feels serviceable in its skill floor and depth, I do think that the effects and visuals definitely helped push it over into being fun and satisfying. The world exploration to me was very fun and exciting. I loved being able to just intuitively figure out overworld puzzles. I loved charting the map, getting collectibles. My absolute most memorable moments in Genshin was discovering large or over-leveled enemies and trying to fight them, and then promptly getting my ass beat. My very first experience with this was with the electrohypostasis, which killed me several times, and also fighting the Ruined Guardian and being absolutely ecstatic that shooting in its eye staggered it. Sounds like a very low bar, but I didn't have very high expectations for this game. And a part of that led me to using the bow as like my favorite weapon for at least the first portion of me actually playing the game. My favorite weapon then was the Claymore, just for how good it felt to use. It felt powerful. It was heavy, yes, but it knocked back small enemies with ease. I felt like I really had to time my dodges and get in my swings for that opening, and it just felt right. I also thought that the main mechanics of mixing characters' elements to different kinds of creating elemental reactions was pretty novel for what it was, and I thought it was kind of interesting. Now you might be thinking, you just gushed for like 10 minutes about how much you enjoyed the game. What exactly do you dislike about it? Are you defending Genshin Impact? That's kind of cringe. And that straw man that I just came up with, yes and no. I want to really illustrate my opinions on Genshin and other gacha games and its similar structure and eventual pipeline, because I find it fascinating to see where the game goes from here. So then, why did I stop playing? It was repetition and boredom. I mentioned briefly that the combat of this game is only serviceable in its quality, and I wasn't really lying. And yes, while the visuals and flashing colors looked very cool, there's only so many times you can watch the same animations until it becomes stale. The combat lacks depth. Oftentimes, the most effective way to kill enemies and win fights is just to spam buttons. And some may argue that there's skill to be had in timing your dodges. Maybe they're correct. I find that more oftentimes than not, enemies typically have very simple and easy to avoid attack telegraphs. Occasionally you can also just power through and ignore all of their attacks. The exception to this are the weekly bosses, which have more complex attack patterns and gimmicks, but the key word here is weekly. You're not going to be fighting them very frequently, and there aren't nearly enough of them to keep things fresh. When enemy variety doesn't exist, it can be difficult to find enjoyment in this game, because no matter what the situation is, your response will always be pressing the exact same buttons. So, how do we fix this repetition issue? The answer is very simple. It's gacha. When you can no longer find enjoyment in the enemy variety or a lack thereof, you can always try to obtain new characters that can help mix up your playstyle. Except, remember what I said about how the most efficient solution is usually the one that requires the least brain cells? Because you can only have so many characters that vaguely fit into different playstyles, but they all kind of fall into one of three categories, being DPS, sub-DPS, and support. There's probably more specific categorizations than this, but this video isn't about Genshin, nor do I know enough to talk about it at length, so I won't. Each of these categories tend to lend themselves to not a whole lot of playstyles, and yes, there are some characters where they have their own unique gimmicks, like weightier attacks, plunging attacks without jumping, or charging your basic attack. My point still stands. When you're making a pool of gameplay that's supposed to be used for thousands and thousands of hours, you have to make sure that pool is at least a couple hundred meters deep, otherwise your players are just going to dive in and break their arms and necks. Oh look, what's this? They expanded the pool by introducing a new core mechanic, Dendro. Damn, guess it's time to transition to my next point. This only really applies if you're in the same situation as me, where you haven't touched or even thought about Genshin or Hoyoverse for roughly half a year at that point. When the whole new thing is suddenly introduced to disrupt and refresh up those old mechanics, that should sound pretty exciting. I mean, I did just talk about how much I liked the learning and the discovery in this game, so I should have been ecstatic, right? I really wasn't. In fact, I redownloaded Genshin for some unknown depraved reason, and when I stepped foot into Sumeru and started trying out Dendro characters, nothing really changed. I was still doing the same button press combinations and putting the same controls and getting mostly the same responses, except this time I understood what I was doing even less. Now, an issue I haven't brought up before with Genshin and a lot of these gacha games is that they all tend to suffer from bad jargon, the worst formatting possible, and writing that's just excessively verbose. Kinda like the script. Essentially, they really like coming up with new specific terms to describe really normal things. And I'm aware that a lot of this is just a lore thing. They just want to make the games more immersive for the players, and that's fine. But in my opinion, video games tend to be best when they are simple. Even if they wanted to refer to these specific game mechanics with new terms, I would at least prefer that the UI and skill descriptions don't get the same treatment. This is way too wordy for me to sift through. Plus, I've been getting by just fine without actually learning or understanding anything, so why would I bother trying to untangle this mess? Well, I just mentioned the lore, I won't be talking about it here because it's just too many words, and reading is for nerds. All the strange writing decisions combined partially lead me to believe that Hoyoverse doesn't actually care if their games are any good and just kind of want to waste our time. But I know Hoyoverse would never do that, because they've always been really nice and super respectful to everyone. In fact, they were so kind and gracious, seeing all the feedback that Genshin got, that they released another game roughly 2 years later in 2023. Honkai Star Rail dropped in mid-2023, and it certainly came out. Star Rail had this relatively big hype behind it because it was the first game to be released by Hoyoverse after the hit that Genshin was. And while I say this, I literally forgot about Star Rail's release. When I was notified that Star Rail was officially released and available to play, I hadn't thought about Genshin or Hoyoverse for months. I straight up forgot Star Rail existed, and I forgot that I pre-registered for it. I only started playing the game pretty regularly around a month after it dropped, then quit after 2 months before returning in late December of 2023, and I've been playing the game pretty regularly ever since. So, what have I gathered from all my time playing Star Rail, and why haven't I quit yet? Now, I'm aware that Star Rail and Genshin aren't very comparable to each other, just by the sheer fact that these two games are vastly and fundamentally different. I do want to point out some things that Star Rail does better than Genshin, design choices that make Star Rail a much more bearable gacha game experience than Genshin is, especially in the long term. I've brought up before that gacha is kind of a genre of games in its own right, and just like most genres, it will mix well with some better than others. When making the core game concepts, gacha games have to try a little harder to make sure that your games have enough depth and complexity. There has to be something to learn, to discover, to master. It has to be varied. There has to be a variety of ways to respond to a variety of situations. It has to be well paced. If it's too fast, you'll reach endgame content too quickly with nothing to do, and if it's too slow, it becomes boring and frustrating your players into quitting because you won't stop holding their friggin' hands. All these points are important in any video game, but especially gacha games. If you're looking to make something that could take months to update and release new content, you have to make sure that your starting point is strong enough to pull people in, but not too daunting that it overwhelms, but still takes time to learn and understand. So, how do we handle gacha in games correctly? Typically, most gacha games will tick off one of those two boxes, but I find that Star Rail is able to tick off both. Star Rail has much more in-depth gameplay and mechanics than Genshin, at least to me. Either that or Star Rail is just much better at explaining their mechanics in an actual fight. Star Rail is extremely varied. You have a plethora of characters to choose from, and their playstyles are all extremely varied, especially on the 1.x patches. While still playing off the core mechanics of the game, you can choose to respond to enemy encounters depending on what you prefer or how you understood the game. You can brute force your way through, relying on critical hits. What if you're a silly little guy that likes silly little mechanics? How about follow-up attacks? Attacks that trigger outside of a character's turn automatically upon conditions being fulfilled. Or what about damage over time? It does damage over time, that's what it does. There's just a little bit of everything, all with varying levels of difficulty, accessibility, and viability that helps to push the game a long way. You don't only have one way to respond to any given situation, you can choose which ones you prefer. But if you don't want to use any alternative solutions, the standard brute force method still works. Perhaps not as effective as the varied solutions, but that's how these types of games should be. It should allow you to play with whatever you have on hand. It should reward you for understanding and using the mechanics it's introduced, but doesn't completely wall you if you don't have access to those alternative solutions. That's called foreshadowing. Star Rail is pretty well paced considering it is a gacha game. There are multiple factors that play into this, but the main one is that it is turn-based. A lot of existing gacha games, old and new, are turn-based, and for good reason. Turn-based games typically demand less energy and focus from players, and that's the type of gameplay gacha games need in order to keep you invested in the long run. I enjoyed Genshin's combat, don't get me wrong, but it feels like a chore whenever I had to frantically click my mouse when I needed to upgrade a character, which was always. With Star Rail, I felt like I wasn't being forced to put in nearly as much effort in the tedious parts of the game, aka the grinding. Which also brings me to the auto-battling system, which I actually like to defend in Star Rail. While the combat of Star Rail is undoubtedly its main gameplay, auto-battling also exists as an option to take away the tedious parts of the game. If a mechanic exists in your game that allows you to cut out repetitive tasks, making experience more enjoyable, I do think that it serves the game for better. And like I said, it is an option. You don't have to use it. If you don't want to, you can play through every battle yourself. You have the ability to do so. But auto-battling does help if you don't have the time, energy, or just don't want to do these things. It also helps with the repetition issue. You won't feel nearly as burnt out if you're not doing the same tasks in the same way every day. While I just praised Star Rail for how well it handled its core gameplay, I did rip into Genshin pretty egregiously, so let's do this fairly. The interesting point to me about Honkai Star Rail when critiquing it as a game is that the majority of the things I find wrong with the game come from the fact that it is a gacha game at its core. I mentioned repetition and boredom as part of the reason why I quit Genshin Impact in the first place, but this issue is something that prevails and plagues in basically every gacha game ever, due to how these games are forced to be structured in order to keep players invested. If you've never played a gacha game before, especially not long-term, which is basically most people, these games are an investment of your time and effort. Not to say that the games are entirely unfun or a complete chore, because I personally wouldn't be playing these games at all if that were the case. But when you start to get really invested in these games, they take up a not inconsequential amount of time. They demand that you log in every day and play their same tasks daily. They demand that you continue to do repetitive activities in order to progress and unlock new gameplay experiences constantly. And eventually you reach the end. But it's not the end. There's still so many more gameplay opportunities and experiences you haven't had, but you just have to wait for months and months to hopefully come across that one character that introduces a new game mechanic that just clicks with you. Even then, you have a sliver of a chance to even get to play with that mechanic long term. And the only way to have a higher chance of reaching that new game mechanic is that you have to do these repetitive tasks. That character is going to stick around forever. They'll be gone for upwards of months before you have the sliver of a chance to even get them again. And will you even be interested in getting them by then? Even if you do get them, because these characters' playstyles do not change over the course of leveling up or grinding, you'll get bored eventually. Is any of this worth it at all? At what point would it be better off to just quit? Is the conclusion to all this to just not play these games? They're not worth your time? Well, that's somewhat the thing with these games. They have the potential to be good, great even. A lot of them clearly have a lot of heart, soul, personality, and talent put into them. They're usually very fun on the first couple of days, weeks, or maybe even a month, but even the greatest games would get old if you're expected to play them for literal years consecutively. Sometimes it doesn't matter how deep your mechanics are, how pretty the game is, or how nuanced the lore is. To an extent, you cannot and should not stretch them this much, because eventually you'll run out of things to stretch. Your games will rip apart, and the people who will see it are the people who will notice it the absolute quickest, because they are also the people who have spent the most time with it. Which brings me to the most recently released Hoyoverse game. Zenless's release was quite interesting as well in my opinion. While the hype around Hoyoverse games had kind of died down a bit, the general reception for Zenless was already not great. People were already concerned about the gameplay before the game even dropped, and after it did, public reception was kind of mixed. And funnily enough, the absolute most common criticism that this game gets, that it is boring, has a lot of ties to the fact that it is a gacha game. And while I don't entirely agree with this critique, I do think it's very valid. There are a couple of reasons why this might be. 1. Zenless is terribly paced. The game starts mostly okay until it grinds to a halt when it has to do lore exposition and story. The mechanics themselves do require a bit of explanation, but doing this spliced with lore dumping and story progression doesn't work very well, since we don't know anything about these characters, so we don't have a reason to be very invested in their struggles. More on that later. This normally wouldn't be a problem if it were a complete game. You know how I know that? Because this game takes very obvious and heavy inspiration from one of my favorite games of all time, Persona 5. And the game's tutorial is horribly paced. but it's not that big of an issue because it never stops you from progressing or unlocking new things just because they don't exist yet. Plus, their main character and opening are significantly more interesting, but we'll get to that. While the core gameplay of Zenless itself is pretty fun between both the combat and the puzzle sections, I can entirely understand why it sucks for others. Zenless's gameplay flow is non-existent. You have these flashy, high-octane combat sections that are spliced between these puzzles that just take way too long and are way too easy. But I do think these puzzles are here for the better, because trust me when I say that if they did not exist, you would have gotten bored of Zenless even quicker. Number 2. Zenless is too easy. It suffers from a pretty similar problem that Genshin does, but the twist here is that the specialized and trained way to play the game seems to only be slightly more, if not just as effective as playing it casually. The game really doesn't punish you for failing parries, dodges, counters, etc. because the enemies just don't hit very hard. Yeah, it's satisfying to get those parries, but you could just not and you would be fine. At least when you're starting the game, which makes sense. You don't want to punish the players instantly when they're just learning the game, but you're still hammering in the same mechanics over and over again. All the enemies here seem to hit the same. Why not throw in a curveball every once in a while? One of the first times they did, I felt it was actually really fun. It was with the ballet twins. They hit hard, they're fast. They have pretty clear attack telegraphs like most other enemies in the game, but the fact that you have to keep track of both of them was enough to make it challenging and fun. In newer versions of the game, they added modes of the battle tower and the Chiyu defense without a time limit, and I can truly see what the vision for the game can be. The enemies here hit hard, and they punish you pretty severely if you miss your parries or dodges. The fights here are fast, they're action-packed, challenging, and exhilarating. It truly felt great with all the animations, effects, and sound design that just make this combat feel exceedingly rewarding. But this isn't me giving them an excuse. It should not take 60 hours of grinding through tedium in order to get to the good part. A part of me feels like this is intentional in a way. They want the game to be easy enough that anyone can get into it, something casual but still fun and satisfying, but they also want to make something harder for the people who are more serious about the game as well. Funnily enough, Zenless does actually have a difficulty setting unlike other Hoyoverse games, but I never felt like it made a difference whether I was playing with it on or off. The difficulty ramp was just not nearly as polished as it should be and left a lot to be desired. Number 3. Zenless's protagonists are not compelling. This is going to be very brief because, like I said, I'm not going to be talking about lore, that shit's for nerds. As much as I don't love Aether and Lumine for their blandness, their motivations are extremely clear from the very beginning. Plus, they do a very good job as an audience surrogate because they've never been to this world before. Hillis and Stell do a pretty decent job of the very same thing with a bit more lighthearted goofiness to them. Belle and Wise do not offer anything in terms of motivations or a reason to root for these characters. They've got a bit more personality than previous protagonists, sure, but these guys are supposedly experts in their field. Why do they need to be told how to do their jobs? They seem capable in basically every scenario, so why should we be worried about whether they'll succeed? And while I enjoy their banter and sibling dynamic, we also only learn about their actual motivations for being hackers in Chapter 5. You know, the entire premise of the game, which is wild to me, but okay. Number 4. Zenless is lacking content. While I don't think this is entirely true, since I think a part of the reason people may feel this way is that the game's just too easy, but yeah, there's just not very much to do. The characters themselves do offer quite a variety of playstyles, but it's day 1 in a gacha game. You're not gonna have very many characters built yet, so you just be playing with your favorites. Plus, because it is a gacha game, the content has to be dripped down very slowly to keep the players invested and looking forward to new updates. The content in the game and the mechanics it plays around with just don't take a whole lot of twists and turns. We gotta save that for at least a couple months. I feel very conflicted about this game because I want to enjoy it for what it is. It's quirky, it's fun and flashy. It doesn't really try to hide the fact that it's silly, and it doesn't take itself very seriously either, which I think is a breath of fresh air in this genre. But the more I play, the more infuriated I am with this game. I don't love it as much as I want to, but I also don't want to hate it. I think the game is pretty, it's charming, the story is light but intriguing enough that I don't mind it. The action is its highlight. And despite the fact the game just came out, I'm kind of already getting exasperated with it. In the end, it just leaves me feeling disappointed and kind of sad. There are clearly a lot of very skilled people working on these games, and I want to see where the game goes from here. I want to see what the developers have in mind for how they could play with this colorful world they've created, but I just can't bring myself to be as invested because it's such a chore, and I kind of already know that it will just lead to boredom and repetition eventually. So why do we play these games? If we know that these games will end in sadness and disappointment, why do we continue to play them? There are other games out there these games take heavy inspiration from that are out there and exist and are good without being gacha games. Well, I don't think these games are entirely derivative, nor is its gameplay the only thing people look for when getting into them. At its core, gacha games are highly accessible and very casual. Anyone can get into them because of their simplicity. Part of the joy in these games is that they are easy. You don't have to put in a lot of effort to succeed, to have fun, or to win. And I think that's fine. In a world where everything's already so complicated and difficult, having something like this and enjoying it is perfectly okay. Maybe you don't want to put in the commitment to paying the money and sitting down and finishing a game. Maybe you can't afford to play these games, whether for financial or timely obligations. Maybe you just don't have access to the consoles or devices required to play these games in the first place. Whatever the reason may be, games like this continue to fill the void, the dopamine we all so desperately crave. All within our reach, the desire for fulfillment, motivation, and happiness without much struggle is all very human. And unfortunately, that humanity is something that big companies are always looking to exploit. That's just the way things are, because of our stubbornness, our desire to just feel happy enough to get through the day, for our efforts, time, and love to pay off, that we have the teeny tiny chance of getting at the click of just one button. The script has gone through a lot of writing and rewriting, and it was initially going to end on a much more nihilistic note, but I don't want that. I want to believe there's a chance, no matter how statistically improbable, that there has to be an optimistic ending to all this. I don't want our humanity to be our curse. Maybe I'm just too naive or too stubborn to accept it as it is, but I also think this unrelenting hopefulness is something that is very inherently human. No matter how much the world crushes us down, we still want to hope that everything will turn out fine eventually. This unbreakable will, whether it's a curse or a blessing, it's a part of all of us, and it keeps us going. It keeps motivating us because I think deep down we're all at least a little afraid that life has no inherent meaning. The fact that eventually we'd go right back to where we began, oblivion. That at the end of the day, we might all just be human. So no matter how cliche this is, we should just try to enjoy what we have now while it lasts. It's perfectly fine to be sad, but spending your limited time worrying about how your end will be too soon doesn't matter because it will always be too soon. There's no promise of a happily ever after, but there is a promise of an ever after. So let's just enjoy this as it is. Which is why I'll now be talking about Honkai Star Rail meta, the top rankings, and whether you should invest. So I'll be talking about and ranking Star Rail characters based on these categories that I deem to be the most important when talking about whether you should invest in these characters as units. Number 1. Flexibility. How well does this unit perform across a variety of gameplay situations? Are they a jack of all trades, master of none, or are they only applicable but highly viable in niche circumstances? Number 2. Ease of setup. How easy is the unit to set up in order to reach their full potential, or even be viable at all? The stats they require, the teammates they need, how difficult or simple is it to make that unit as effective as they need to be? Number 3. Team contribution. How much do they contribute to the team? Do they need their teammates to do the heavy lifting, or are they more self-sustainable? And number 4. Raw power. How high can they make that damage number go? To note, I made the spreadsheet for all of this at roughly the release of Star Rail version 2.5, and even so I didn't include Link Shot or Face Xiao in the spreadsheet because I, quite frankly, didn't understand how their mechanics worked or how well they perform in practical scenarios. So just assume they're somewhere in the top 10. I don't know. Also, the way I rated these units are purely based on my own personal experiences with them, which means how well built they are, how many copies I have of them, and just my general opinion based on how I like to play the game. But even if I'm objectively wrong, I do still think my opinion holds water purely because I've been a free-to-play player for the entirety of my duration playing this game. So that hopefully means I'll have had the experience of the average player. Let me explain the mechanics of a fight and the categorizations of these units very quickly, since I'll be referring to it quite a bit. Star Rail is a turn-based game where units on the field, both ally and enemy, take turns based on their speed stat. Each character in Star Rail are equipped with 4 main ways they can engage in a fight. Number 1. Basic attack. It does minimal damage, but it grants you skill points. Number 2. Skill. It requires skill points to use, but it can do a myriad of things like damage, healing, buffing, debuffing. You can hold a maximum of 5 skill points at any given time. Number 3. Ultimate. This is the strongest and most impactful move a character can use once they've gained enough energy. Energy can be gained by acting in a fight, by basic attack, skill, taking damage, dealing damage, etc. It can also be used at any point in the fight, including outside of that unit's turn. And number 4 is the passive. These are abilities that activate automatically upon certain conditions being fulfilled. The units each have one elemental type. This type dictates what elemental damage they will deal. You'll notice that these enemies have a bar above their HP bar. That is their weakness bar. You can reduce that weakness bar by attacking the enemy with the corresponding weakness type as indicated by these symbols. Upon breaking their weakness, they will take break damage, have their actions slowed down, take more damage from any subsequent attacks, and be inflicted with a weakness break effect that corresponds with whatever elemental type you broke their weakness with. These are categorized into 2 separate things, which I'm choosing to call dots, which is also known as damage over time, and control. Dots includes fire, wind, lightning, and physical. All dots do basically the same thing. They deal damage over time. Whenever an enemy takes an action, they'll deal damage and then reduce its stack. On the other side is control, which includes ice, imaginary, and quantum. Imaginary slows down enemies and reduces their defense. I've never personally felt that this part was very impactful, however. The other one is quantum. Every time you hit an enemy with this effect, they will gain a stack. The more stacks they have, the more damage they'll take once it is their turn again, and they can stack up to a maximum of 5 times. Very cool idea in theory, never actually that important in practice. Ice freezes the enemy. Freeze is essentially the most impactful status effect in this game because it effectively lets you take up 2 enemy turns. And just like any turn-based RPGs, the units also have their own roles and classes. The classes of these units are referred to as paths and can be roughly divided into DPS, supports, and sustains. You're allowed to add up to 4 characters in one team comp in any given battle, so your team comp will typically be structured in one of 2 ways, but put a pin in that. You have the solo DPS, also known as hyper carry, and dual DPS. Solo DPSs requires one main DPS, all the other team members will support that DPS. The good parts about hyper carry is that it is very flexible. Most damage dealers that fit in this category already hit very hard themselves. They don't care about gimmicks, it's just pure brute force. The team is volatile. It has to be at least solidly built to tackle specific endgame modes in order to brute force through them. If your main DPS happens to go down, there's little to nothing you can do to continue that fight. This team comp is also not as effective as more gimmicky ones in endgame scenarios, just solely based on what mechanics they cater to. On the other hand, we have the dual DPS. You have one main DPS, one sub DPS. The other team members kind of round out the team comp. This team comp is very inflexible. With some exceptions, this team comp type is usually reserved for specific endgame modes that put down specific criteria you have to fulfill. Teams that fit in this category are usually pretty niche in their usage. They're usually difficult to set up. They require more prerequisite characters, and more often than not, those characters are not widely available. However, they can be extremely strong and effective in niche scenarios where hypercarry teams may struggle, and I just personally think they're more fun. Let's get into the meta timeline. Version 1.0 on launch. The meta that mattered for this version was just hypercarry crits. Typically, you would have a team with one main DPS and the rest of the team just support that DPS, and that worked fine. Your normal crits characters included Jingyun, Sela, and Yanxing. These characters are all hypercarry DPSs that deal a shitload of damage just purely based on critical hits and being fast. We also see the roots of characters will become quite interesting in the meta timeline later. Characters like Bronya, Tingyun, Pela, and Asta. These guys were generally the supports that mattered a lot in the early versions of the game and will continue to matter in later versions of the game. We also have something that I like to call the sustain deficit, which just means we don't have a lot of sustained characters to choose from. That will become important later. In version 1.1, a new notable character that was added was Silverwolf. She has the ability to implant a weakness type that corresponds to any teammate that you have on an enemy with her skill. I do think this is a pretty interesting gimmick that bypasses one of the game's core mechanics, and I think she's pretty cool for that. Version 1.2 was the release of Blade and Kafka. Blade was our first real taste of a hypercarry DPS. He is decently tanky, pretty self-sustainable, and he doesn't care about speed or turn order because he has follow-up attacks that just activate outside of his turn, and he also needs to take damage in order to deal big damage. And the other character that was added here was Kafka. She birthed what we now call dots, which is damage over time. What she can do is that she can make every damage over time effect on an enemy activate instantly with her skill or ultimate. However, this kind of team comp requires specific characters that actually apply those damage over time, and these characters were a bit niche. Next is version 1.3, which came the release of Fushun and Lynx. Fushun is a very busted and versatile sustain that came out. She is able to fill 3 roles at once, being she's able to do damage reduction, has follow-up healing that just activates automatically, and she has an unconditional crit rate boost. The other character that was released here was also Lynx, who is a 4-star that you can get guaranteed just by playing the game, and the great part about her is that she made dependable sustain so much more widely accessible. This version was also the introduction of a specific game mode called Pure Fiction. It is a game mode with a lot of waves of enemies and a limited amount of turns for you to deal damage and kill them. This made characters with AoE attacks and follow-up attacks finally relevant, because prior to this we've only had Memory of Chaos, and that didn't have very many enemies in it. We also saw the birth of a very niche and interesting team comp, in my opinion, called Mono Quantum. The way this team comp works is that you have one main character that is very required, and that is Silverwolf. She implants a specific weakness type, a random one, based on whatever teammates you have on the team. However, if every single character on the team is a quantum character, then she'll just implant quantum weakness and just go to town. Having 2 quantum sustains helped with this significantly, and there were also 2 quantum damage dealers that existed already. One of them is just free to get if you play the game. Version 1.4 was the release of Jinliu, who is a frailer version of Blade. She hits a little harder and she is more SP friendly, which is to say that she doesn't use a lot of skill points in order to do stuff. Another character that was released in this version was also Topaz and Numbi, who gives us a better introduction into follow-up characters, and they'll become more important later. Next is version 1.5 with the release of Huohua, who was essentially the best healer yet. She has insane cleanse capabilities. She is very, very SP friendly. She has energy regen and attack buff that is completely unconditional. Version 1.6 is what I like to call the Omen. The main notable character here is Run Mei. She increases weakness break efficiency by a whopping 50%. She also has a completely unconditional damage buff and lets you break enemy weakness significantly quicker. Just generally really, really strong. There's also the character of Shui Yi, is able to ignore type resistances with her ult, something that I thought was actually pretty cool and novel, just solely because yes, she is a 4-star, but her skill is pretty invaluable and you can't get that anywhere else. And another character that came out was Dr. Ratio, who is a free 5-star that is honestly pretty good as a follow-up character. Version 2.0 was Penacony's release. The main characters that came out in this version were Sparkle and Black Swan. We have Sparkle, who introduces a gimmick that allows you to hold up to 7 skill points at a time. She also has Action Advance, which allows you to let a teammate take action quicker, and she also increases crit damage based on how many skill points you've consumed. And she basically power crept a different 4-star that has the same gimmick as her in 2 versions. So that's cool. The other character that came out in this version was Black Swan. She is the ultimate damage over time character. She has something called Arcana, which is damage over time basically. It stacks up to 50 times just because. She's also extremely SP friendly and just hits very hard. Version 2.1 is what I like to call the uh-oh because of this one specifically. The character that came out in this version was Acheron, and she introduced us to a new type of team comp where it's just Nihility Gang. Every single character, they just need to be able to do debuffs. The main way that she works is whenever an enemy receives a debuff, she'll gain a stack of her ultimate. She doesn't rely on energy in order to use it. You just need to inflict debuffs. Upon having enough stacks, she's able to unleash her ultimate, which hits every single enemy and ignores type resistances. She also just outputs absurd amounts of damage in general. The other 2 characters that came out in this version were Aventurine and Gallagher. Pretty important for the meta timeline just solely because they were sustains that were insanely good. Aventurine has follow-up attacks with his shield. He's super reliable as a sustain. He also is able to increase his teammates' effect res, which is the resistance against receiving debuffs from the enemy. This includes both damage over time effects and also includes crowd control effects, which is very very, very important. The other character that came out here was Gallagher. He is a 4-star healer that is really good. He deals pretty decent damage on his own. He has good healing. He's extremely SP friendly, and he also gets the ability to dispel debuffs on E2, which means you need 3 copies of him to get it, which I honestly don't think is that bad because he is a 4-star. On version 2.2, we see the release of 3 characters. Was basically the calm before the storm, in my opinion. The very first character that came out in this version was Boothill. He was the first real taste of a break DPS, which is a damage dealer that relies solely on breaking enemies' weakness in order to deal damage. The way he works is that he implants physical weakness with his ultimate, and he also has insane weakness break efficiency on his own. The other character that came out is Robin, who is a support that continues to be extremely important. She's very, very SP friendly. She gets unconditional damage buffs. She also has 100% action advance, which just means that she's capable of letting her teammates take action instantly, like the entire team. And she also just outputs absurd amounts of damage even on her own. And the last character that came out in this version is Harmony Trailblazer. And Harmony Trailblazer gave us something called Super Break. I assume it's called that because it super broke the game. The way that Super Break works is that it is a damage multiplier that is applied onto enemies when taking damage while they are weakness broken. How much that multiplier does is dependent on the attacker's weakness break efficiency. For example, a basic attack that only hits one target isn't going to do a lot of damage, but something with bounce where it hits multiple times will do a lot. The multiplier is entirely unconditional and has a 100% chance of activating. You only need the prerequisite break effect stat to do big damage. Hence the reason why break is so much more consistent than crits. Version 2.3 was the version that I would personally like to say kind of broke everything, like fully. The character that came out in this version, the most notable one anyway, was Firefly. She is completely insane, and I will talk about her more later. The main notable strategy for this version was the Firefly Hyper Break, where you have Firefly, does the weakness breaking, you have Runmei, who increases weakness break efficiency, you have Harmony Trailblazer, who gives you the super break buff, and Gallagher, who breaks weakness and applies a debuff that makes enemies take extra break damage. Next, version 2.4 was the release of Yunli, who is a slightly more self-sustainable version of Clara. Jiao Shu, the nihility character that is the most catered to Acheron, like the nichest character I've ever seen in my life, and March, who is actually a pretty good 4-star that you get for free. Version 2.5 was Fei Xiao, who has the ability to just ignore type resistances on ult because why not? And she's also really good with follow-up attacks. You also get Lingsha, who is basically just a better version of Gallagher, I'm not even gonna lie. Version 2.6 was Rappa, which is another character that ignores type resistances on ult. Are we noticing a trend here? Version 2.7 is 2 characters that I think are also utterly broken, which is Sunday, who I will talk more about later, and also Fugue or Fugue, who is a nihility character that 1, she grants the super break buff, 2, she lets other characters ignore type resistances, and 3, she lets you break weakness twice. Why not, I guess. Next is version 3.0, which is the latest as of me making this, or when I made this presentation anyway, was the release of the Herta. She is an Erudition character that just does completely insane amounts of damage. She introduces something called true damage, which I don't actually know what it does. I just know that it does a lot of damage. She can deal upwards of 1 million damage, which is absolutely insane, but okay. Next is going to be the most honorable or funniest power creepers and power creeps characters. Let's go. Oh, where do we begin? When talking about Star Rail meta, I don't think it's possible to avoid talking about Yanxing. He was power crept fully based on the numbers game. He lost purely because he just doesn't have the same multipliers other characters have. I do think that his gimmick is pretty interesting, but it's kind of awful in practice. The way that he works is that when he does not take HP damage for a certain amount of turns, his passive will activate. This passive allows him to be quicker, increase his crit damage, and lets him do his follow-up attack. It is an attack that does pretty minimal damage, but has a high chance of freezing the enemy. His gimmick was pretty interesting, but it was kind of terrible in practice, mainly because he really needed sustains that could give reliable shields. The only person in earlier versions then was Jeopard, or Jeopard, who is a 5-star as well. You're probably not going to have the both of them. The only other option at the time was March 7th, who grants shield to only one character at a time, which might sound good, but in this game there's something called taunt values. This is something that you don't really see in the actual game itself because it doesn't tell you, but characters of different classes have different chances of being hit. For example, characters that are tanks are much more likely to be hit than characters like Yanxing, who is a DPS. However, that taunt value can be increased or decreased based on the HP that character has or other stats that they have. For example, if your character is shielded, they are more likely to be attacked. Hence why he's not good with March. The other character that works here is Preservation Trailblazer that has taunt, but still, it's not reliable. Next character is Jeopard, and I've been dragging this man since launch. I cannot keep bullying him. I'm sorry. I never thought he was good. People were hyping him up on launch. I don't think he's that good, guys, not even on launch. And the large reason why is because he's so SP heavy. He relies a lot on his ultimate because that is the only way he can grant shield. And while he grants shield to the entire team, it is not reliable, at least not to my experience. His skill has a very high chance of freezing the enemy, but he's been getting usurped by absolutely every other sustain in the game, especially now that enemies' resistance against freeze is so much higher. Next is Bailu. Something that I find kind of insane is that Bailu is the only healer in the entire game without the ability to dispel debuffs. Not having cleanse in older versions of Star Rail is not that big of a deal, you could take it or leave it, but as time went on, people started to realize just how unreliable Bailu really was. Her healing is bouncing, so even if the base amount was higher than the average 4-star, you still couldn't target all of it into the character that you need. The buff that she gives is so mediocre that it really doesn't matter. Her main unique gimmick was a once per battle instant revive, which is extremely mediocre in my opinion, and even worse now that Ho gets the same thing on one of her Eidolons while Bailu can't even get one dispel. Safe to say, it was simply better to give up the one-time revive for more consistent survivability and safety nets against crowd controls. Oh, this one hurts me. Bronya used to be literally one of the best DPSs in the game because she lets you do something that is completely invaluable. She grants you the ability to let a teammate instantly take action in a turn-based game. She also has pretty good damage buffs in her own right, and she is capable of dispelling debuffs as well. However, in more recent versions, she's been completely power crept by Sunday, who does basically the same thing she does, but is much more SP friendly. He also grants an unconditional crit rate boost and energy regen, and Bronya just can't compete with any of that. Next up is Himeko. And her funny little meta life cycle. Himeko used to be a B- tier character because pure fiction didn't exist. She just wasn't very good. The way that she works is that she'll do a follow-up attack that hits every enemy every third time that you break an enemy weakness with any character on your team, which is not good. It wasn't good. Up until Pure Fiction, in which she became pretty good along with Herta, where they paired together to do big damage in very small amount of turns. And this kind of leads me to the next point, dots as a whole, the damage overtime gang. I always feel a little betrayed talking about this, but I would consider myself a dots truther. I was a Kafka main through and through ever since she came out, and back then I somewhat saw dots and follow-up attacks as being in the same ballpark with how niche they were. There weren't a lot of dots or follow-up characters, and neither of them can give out consistent or reliable damage, but when they worked, they worked. When Pure Fiction came out as a game mode, it felt like Star Rail was trying to make dots and follow-ups more viable for endgame modes as well, and I appreciated that a lot. However, we haven't had a proper dots character since Black Swan in version 2.0, and it is now version 3.0, and there are no signs of dots being relevant ever again. But since then, we have had follow-up after follow-up, and I kid you not, there are almost as many follow-up characters as your standard crits character, as seen by this. I'm not talking about them just having it, but it being their main gimmick. It feels like being a lonely kid who had lunch with your best friend for a year until one day they just decide to get up and go sit with the popular kids. Next up is Sparkle and the unrealized potential of skill points. Like I said, the way that she works is that she grants the ability to have 7 maximum skill points instead of 5. With each skill point consumed, you get a crit damage buff. She also gives you 4 skill points on ult, and she also gets action advances. The main problem is that crits are not nearly as reliable as you need them to be. She's also so insanely niche that oftentimes there will always be a better support option for your team rather than Sparkle, one that requires less investment and maintenance. She still has the potential to be very interesting and allow for more complex strategizing. What if you get a better boost with every other skill point consumed? What if characters require more than 1 skill point to use their skill at all? Next is Boothill. Before Boothill's drop, there were a lot of showcases and talk about how busted he was. He worked based on breaking weakness and momentum. I thought he was a decently designed character, but still felt like he was a bit overhyped. But mostly because Hunt characters never gelled with me anyway. After he dropped, everyone was still mostly hyped about him, but there was a realization to be had. You really need his supports. Without Renmei or Bronya, Boothill's become significantly less viable. And while some may disagree with me, I do think that Firefly is the ultimate nail in the coffin for Boothill. She does basically everything he does, but better, which is kind of crazy considering their release was only 2 weeks apart. Firefly relies on popping ultimate and murdering absolutely everything with Super Break, but the busted part about her is just how over-designed her kit is. It's almost like the devs were scared of giving her a downside when making her. She starts her fight with 50% energy. She has to use her skill once to get it to max. When using her skill, she loses 40% of her total HP, which sounds like a lot, but popping her ultimate allows her to take action instantly, removes a debuff from her, and gives her lifesteal. While using her ultimate, she is significantly faster, she can ignore type resistances, and can also implant fire weakness. Are you worried about her dying or being crowd controlled? Well, don't be, because her passive reduces the damage that she takes and increases her effect resistance the lower her HP is. Her core flaw is that she relies heavily on using her ultimate, and she has a pretty high energy cap, but that doesn't matter too much because you can typically get her ult up and running in 2 turns or less. Next up are the supports that have always been good since day one and kind of continue to be good because no one else has filled their niches. Bronya used to be in this section until Sunday's release. Characters that are here are Tingyun and Pela. Tingyun has the ability to instantly regenerate 50% of the character's energy and increase their damage unconditionally, and Pela has an unconditional defense reduction on all enemies. It doesn't matter what gear you put on her, she's gonna do her job. While we're on the topic of supports being very good, another interesting point about Star Rail that I find is just the fact that the supports in this game tend to outlast the DPSs in terms of their meta lifespan. This could be just due to the fact that they release DPSs more often, so it's much more likely that their use cases will overlap, therefore one will wind up becoming less viable as the game warps around newer units. Though I do think it is still quite odd considering there are about just as many standard hypercarry damage dealers as there are buffers. And seeing stuff like this brings up quite a fascinating point to me. A lot of the times, having a good or well-built buffer matters significantly more than having a well-built DPS. This is because the way a lot of these buffers work is based on a multiplier that scales off of their own stat. For example, Bronya increases her teammates' crit damage stat by a percentage based on her own crit damage stat. There are also supports whose effects are entirely unconditional, as I've mentioned before. This doesn't mean that they're outright better, it just means that they're much easier to build and maintain. Aside from their obvious team boosting purposes, buffers also have a variety of utilities that are unique solely to themselves, mostly. Some of those tools may be more useful than others, but I still think they all have plausible benefits. Now, this somewhat started with the release of Robin, a buffer whose own damage output is utterly insane. There have been other buffers like Harmony Trailblazer who also have the capability to deal large sums of damage, but for the most part you're not relying on Harmony Trailblazer to do the damage. Meanwhile, because of Robin's absurd damage output, it became possible to let her be the real damage dealer and the DPS around her just kind of become the vessels for that damage. And that was when people started to ask some very disconcerting questions. Can we make a team where we just boost the buffers? And that they did. While these teams were niche as hell and had counterparts that were far easier to maintain, I do think the results are extremely impressive. This is Asta Hyperbreak, which is basically the same as Firefly, but you replace Firefly with Asta. The reason why we choose Asta specifically is because of her skill, which has bounce, which means it hits multiple times, and that just gives you a completely insane weakness break efficiency, especially with Renmei. More recent versions of this team also included Lingsha, who is a break healer. She has a summon that takes action independent of her, and her break damage debuff is higher than Gallagher's by like a lot. And aside from this, you also have just standard Robin carry, where you just have follow-up characters and Robin is your main damage dealer. I think a part of the reason why this fascinated me so much was just that this shows how creative you can really be with these teams. It shows the strength of a very solid foundation that rewards you for knowing the mechanics and landscape of the game through and through. That being said, this is the very last character on this honorable mentions, and this is probably the saddest one. Silverwolf, the unit forgotten by the devs. Silverwolf's main gimmick had always been very interesting to me. It's a gimmick that lets you bypass one of the game's core mechanic in a way that feels interesting and fair. And that's usually how you're meant to design playable characters anyway. Make them able to break out of the confines of the game and toy with the rules you've set in place. This way you can make characters that feel both uniquely strong but still fair to the game. Silverwolf's ability to plant a weakness of any type was one such case. I'd say the same with dots and follow-up attacks. The problem here isn't Silverwolf herself, but more or less the way the game has developed without her. At the current point, Silverwolf is mostly useless, except for one extremely niche team comp that isn't even good anymore. Her main gimmick got outclassed by so many characters that come after her, to the point where there really is no reason to use her anymore. It's cool and fun when one character breaks the rules of the game, but when every character breaks those rules too, it becomes the standard. So, here are my final rankings. If you were surprised by any of these, don't be. The top one is Firefly, Robin, Fushun, Jingyu, and Blade. They're just good. And here are also the worst characters, being Jiaoshu, Herda, Xingxue, Hanya, and Yukong. A little sad that Herda is this low, in my opinion, because I like her. But she's just so not flexible. So, to finally answer the question, should you invest in gacha games? No. Obviously, I can't tell you what to do. But if you thought I was going to come on here on live television encouraging the youth to gamble, then you think too little of me. I alluded to NFTs at the beginning of this, and no, the value's all downhill from here. Oh, my back hurts. I've been recording this for literally 2 hours. Thank you so much for watching this video, if you managed to make it all the way here. I'm aware this is way longer than it had any right to be, but I still hope you enjoyed it. Also, if I haven't made it clear already, do not spend money on these games. As much as it is memed, gambling is dangerous. It is an addiction. It's a very slippery slope. So even if you don't care whether or not you're supporting Hoyoverse monetarily, do it for yourself and your own well-being. This video took a solid 6 months to make, and it's essentially 3 scripts combined to one, which is why it's so obnoxiously long. Special thanks to Fructose Tolerant on YouTube for helping me out with this video. If you enjoyed this, I'm not going to ask you to subscribe because there's no promise I'm going to make anything again. But if you like more in-depth analyses that dive deeper into lore and stories in gacha games, head over to Fructose Tolerant. You'll get much more professional videos than this. If you want to see more of me or just support my other endeavors, I have an Instagram where I post art and a Kofi where any money you donate will go towards Palestinians' families' GoFundMes. Thank you so much again for watching this video. That's it. That's the